then his disillusionment, pretty much, in where it had taken, the directions it had gone in, and Susie's been kind of exploring these ideas in her response papers, but I was just telling her in the hallway, I said, like, everything seems to keep coming back to Dick Fulkerson.
Yes.
Would you be interested in
It's
pursuing
a sign, I guess.
It
Yeah.
is. And you had just gotten his book, so
Right. He developed the course in argumentation, the graduate course, evidently, and I don't really know much about that course.
The history of that course, I have, and it was built from his research, the formal argument. So it was 776. So yeah, and they've been looking at some of the syllabi in the office. So either the origin story of that course or something that fleshes out more of a kind of a bibliographic essay on his scholarship. There's plenty from a variety of fields, including his work on Dickens way back. So.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy for a lot of reasons, but his career went a different direction. That he was trained as a Victorianist under Altick at Ohio State, and then he wound up more to composition and argument.
And that story by itself is pretty fascinating. He became a leader in the field, and he helped pretty much establish our PhD program. Those lines of courses in informal argumentation, very important. And I've learned from people who go to the speech conferences that he was quite a name in those, where formal argument hadn't played a much bigger role than it did after a while in comp. So he's a name we need to recover.
And Dr. Bowen may, assume he might know quite a lot about him as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yeah, he and Donna Dunbar Odom and Robin, all of them came in around in early '93, I guess, and so he's been here since '70. But she's going to reach out to him, and I know he'll be delighted.
I'm Bill Lancaster, working on my PhD, as you are aware. And my final project, I'm going to look at the pedagogical practices of Mary Adele. She wrote a textbook on how to write a research paper.
And what years would that have been?
She taught here from, well, she retired in '71, and had taught here for 35 years, Spanish and English. Retired in '71, died in '72, and wrote 4 books during that time period. I don't remember the dates on them specifically. One was a children's book in Spanish, one a history of her hometown, and one a history, a biography of her father, I believe, or her grandfather one.
Hi, my name is Tara Allen. I'm in my last semester of the Master's in Higher Education Teaching program, and I'm also going to graduate in May. And for my final project, my broad topic is post-World War II women's composition studies.
I'm Max, the terrible.
The terrible.
Pretty much. Working on my PhD, my final project is thinking about developing a online or a database that can digitize student papers and sort of use them as a, it has many uses. It can be used for specific topics to generate student research. It can also be used for in linguistics, sort of to analyze the language however they want to, but I'm thinking about doing it in stages. First one being that they digitize the student work, and then moving it toward accumulating this sort of archive so that it can be interactive using Web 2.0 technology and maybe partnering up with other universities. So I'm thinking about setting up that project, maybe trying to do works toward a grant proposal, set it up.
Pre-graded, redacted with names, all the good stuff.
Yeah, I think the difficulty will be identifying the right cluster of essays, and that are, as you said, redacted and available. Probably things that have somehow, for some reason, made it into the special collections. but I love the idea of a grant coming out of this.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something we need. So we don't have Jeff or Tony with us, and I'm surprised by that. They're always here, but I'm eager to turn it over to you, Dr. Hayes. A little bit of a bio, guys. I sent this to you guys. If you don't know, he's our department head. He specializes in 20th century British literature, and I've got the title of his second book project, Martin Amis, A Comprehensive Bibliography and Critical Checklist. And that his first book was...
The beast that won't end.
Is that, I would love to hear about that too. His first book was Understanding Will's Self, the first in-depth critical examination of Self's work. One of the many reasons why I wanted to bring him in was he writes about writers and their texts, and this research agenda certainly has direct links to this course in our work in here. I'm working to help you guys figure out a good project that might make use of local archives and understanding something about writing and writers and writing instruction. What he'll talk about with you today certainly has implications for the teaching of reading and writing in college, the course topic, because writing is writing is writing. And also his work makes some interesting use of the archives. Another really interesting detail is a career trajectory that includes some significant training in creative writing. I know that Bill and some of you others have a real interest in that. And so this is a living, breathing writer who studies living, breathing writers, live people who are alive still. So I have some questions for you. I imagine others do as well. I am happy to start wherever you think. Where would you like to start? Where's a good place?
Oh, it doesn't matter. Sounds like a good place to use.
Okay, well, I'd like to hear a little bit about your current project, the monster that you mentioned. What are you trying to do with that?
No, I'm actually not kidding when I say that it's a monster. It's one of the problems that when you deal with contemporary writers, is that contemporary writers, they tend to keep writing and they keep publishing. And so you have to set really good parameters for what you want to do in terms of a bibliography, and that it's always emerging. That I can have it up to date right now, but will it be up to date if I were to release it in this version 6 months from now or a year from now? And the answer is no, because the writer will, for most likely the next couple of decades, continue writing and continue publishing. And so you have to do a lot of history backtracking and to get caught up to a certain point, and then it becomes a matter of remaining in step. And it's not unlike the Will Self book that I did. And when I finished it, I wanted to bring it up to date in terms of its time of publication with what was at the time the novelist's most recent novel. And it wasn't going to be published until after my book was going to be published, which gives serious problems in terms of quoting it. He allowed me to send me a copy of his typescript to read from, but I wasn't allowed to quote from it because pages, the text would change. But I needed an overview to talk really generally about what he was going to be doing. And then after I had finished everything, he sent me an email to tell me, it's like, oh yeah, and I have these other books coming out. It's my goal to make your book as irrelevant as quickly as I can.
The big race, the big race. Because these two authors are still alive and still writing while you're writing these books, it seems likely that you didn't go, that the Martin Amis collection is not available because he hasn't died or stopped writing, right? Or there's no, what archives does one go to?
Right, well, it depends. That a lot of papers will disperse at different collections, including in private hands, which are a lot harder to get a hold of, as you can imagine. It depends on who the recipient is. There's actually a legal qualification for that the writer, if you were to write a letter, you own the copyright on that letter, but you don't own the artifact of that letter that you send off. So you send that letter off, the artifact artifact itself becomes somebody else's property. And they can trade it, they can sell it, they can do whatever they wish to do with it without your permission. But somebody else can't come and quote from it without receiving permission from you or set up through an institution that will hold those. So you wind up with those sorts of situations. Amos is a good example of that because he actually, it was actually the reverse, because Barnes, a good friend of his, he had a falling out and they had a thing to do, had sent him a letter. And that was the famous end of the friendship letter. And even though he writes in his memoir, Amos does, I have the letter in front of me, but I can't quote from it because I didn't write it and he won't give me his permission. I can tell you that the letter ends in 2 words comprising 7 letters, 3 of which are F. You know? You can figure out the context from there. You know, what would be at the end of the letter. But he couldn't quote from it, even though he was holding it in his hand, you know, had it in front of him at the time. And so it's that kind of a dynamic. Now, I can have a pretty good idea where the Amos letters are going to wind up going, just off of an educated guess, that they're going to go to Los Angeles at the Huntington Library there. Amos was in the weird situation of having a father who was a publishing novelist. And Amos was one of the literary executors. And so he got to make decisions on where those papers were going to go. And so the papers that were in Kingsley's property at the time of his death, and those that the other family had, they sold those to the Huntington. Other libraries have already bought a lot of papers and things. The Ransom Center in Austin, the Harry Ransom Center, is a major archive for these things. It's open, it's researchable. It used to be that you had to make an appointment to go to it. Now you don't. And their collection is astounding. And they have letters there from both Martin and Kingsley and pretty much everyone else. There's a famous story, little anecdote, in Ian Hamilton's book, In Search of J.D. Salinger, which is actually a book I recommend to everyone that's interested in doing literary scholarship, because it's a book about a failed attempt to write a biography on Salinger. Oh. And he was hired, Ian Hamilton, a little backstory, was an editor and a poet. In the 1970s, he was hired to write the biography of the American poet Robert Lowell. And he did a terrific job with the Lowell biography, and he kind of became a biographer after that. For him, the process was disturbing because he knew Lowell as a friend, admired the poetry a great deal, and the things that he found out about Lowell, the man, through doing interviews, reading letters from, ex-spouses and ex-friends and other people. Hamilton wrote that he came out of it not only not liking Lowell as a person, but not able to like the poetry for a long time as a result of what he found out about the man. And so it had that kind of damaging effect. But he continued doing it. In the late or mid-1980s, he was hired to write a biography of J.D. Salinger. You're familiar with Salinger and the problems that would create. Salinger being, notoriously reclusive individual, didn't want to speak to anyone, refused to give interviews or anything like that. Never gave permission for any kind of publication since he quit publishing in the mid-60s. And Lowell started doing it, and he needed to contact people. So he got a cease and desist order from J.D. Salinger's lawyers saying, stop ringing up my, family members, leave them alone. And he continued with his book, and at one point he went to the Ransom Center to read through some letters that they had of Salinger's. And he went through, at the time, he just had the card catalog, and they still have it there, but you have other ways of searching now. And he sort of randomly looking for his friends and realized that they had letters from his friends. And he thought, oh, why not? So he looked up his own name, and saw they had a letter that he had sent to someone there. Oh. And he thought, well, they really do have everything in this place. And it went on that, he didn't write the biography of Salinger, because Salinger brought a lawsuit. Hamilton wasn't worried at first about the lawsuit, because in order for the lawsuit to go forward, Salinger would have to give a deposition. And he knew that Salinger doesn't give interviews, and a legal deposition is the worst kind of interview someone could give. Salinger showed up for the deposition. So instead of writing a book about Salinger, he wrote a far more interesting book about the attempt to write a book about Salinger. And
What led you to Martin Amis specifically and the writing of comprehensive works around a specific author who's still living?
I don't know. I mean, in a way, it's a good question, because it's what I've done for a long time. These were the people I was reading in between college and graduate school. I was staying current with a lot of contemporary literature. It was just something that interested me. When I was in my PhD program, I actually thought, I had brighter ideas, I guess. At one point I had about a 10-second thought process that maybe I wouldn't do contemporary 20th century literature, that I would do Victorian literature as my primary area. The way we did it, we had separate areas. You had a primary area, mine was contemporary 20th century literature. You had a secondary area, so mine was Victorian. And you pretty much equally schooled both ways.
This is at
there.
Mississippi?
Yeah, southern Mississippi. And you had a primary area, critical area as well. And those are all the areas on which you were largely tested for your comprehensive exams, which were unlike ours. It was be locked into an office for a week, and after a few hours each day, you're allowed to emerge with a paper in hand.
Be glad we did do that until not too long ago. So.
And I thought in terms of the job market that maybe it would be more marketable to become a Victorianist instead of a contemporary lit scholar. It's certainly a broader field that way. The best advice my dissertation director gave me was, he said, don't do that. You've got to do contemporary literature. You know these people. You know this work. That's where you need to do it. And my eventual dissertation emerged out of that, and a couple of other things I was interested in. What I really wanted to do for my dissertation was looking at a culture of literary journalism in London, particularly from the 70s through the early 80s. There's sort of a last gasp for a certain type of this literary culture that existed. And I was told, no, that's not good enough in terms of a critical study to be able to do that. I could still give you the chapter organization, the main editors, so I would focus on their publications and all that. And so instead I looked at what was kind of a subset of that, a literary movement that actually emerged out of that culture and had kind of control over a part of it for a while. So that was good. That allowed me to use the critical theory that wasn't going to come into play so much in the more historicist approach that I would have had. In
your research, you're looking what are you actually looking at? You're looking at secondary, I guess, scholarship on these texts, on the texts themselves. You are weaving in biographical elements and any information that you can find from artifacts like the letters. What are you looking at?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, it's both a blessing and a challenge to do contemporary literature. You don't have necessarily a preset narrative from which to work from. That if you're going back and you want to study Dickens, there's now a nice history of commentary on Dickens that you go through that and find your way into it to avoid repeating any of that. With a lot of contemporary writers, in fact, you don't have that. So you have to try to make sense of it and start to construct the narrative that way. Before I did my comprehensive, not even my comprehensive exams, just my qualifying exams early on in my PhD program, when I had to select my areas and my major author, which was Martin Amis, that I had to justify him as a major author. Forget the fact that now, I think there'd be no question about that anywhere. Is routinely regarded as one of the two leading British writers, of his age, and really since, I think almost post-war, in terms of publication. But at the time, as I recall, there were less than, maybe they're right about 40 entries in the MLA bibliography, including, dissertations that might have mentioned him, a book on him. And I remember, trying to convince my committee, there's not a lot of scholarship right now. By the time I graduate, there will be a lot more scholarship, and it's going to continue to build. We're at this moment right now where people are finally understanding and recognizing what's happening, that the scholarship will build. And, sure enough, searching now, and there are lots of publications. There's now even a terrible biography, but there's a biography on him. And, a lot of critical studies, too, that have suspiciously similar names. And I could rant about the second one, but I won't. Totally ignoring the first one that came out with that. But there's a good critical body. But what you have to do is when you're doing contemporary literature, you don't really have the benefit of hindsight. You have to try to recognize patterns as they're emerging to be able to make an argument about what's happening. It's a lot harder to see something kind of from a ground level than from a bird's view where you're overlooking and you start to see things emerge a lot clearly. Because it's all shifting and it's all changing around you. And this is where bibliography, I think, gives a contemporary scholar a tremendous advantage. I look at a good bibliography, such as one I'm working on with a colleague in Georgia, and we've been doing this thing for years. In fact, we became friends through the bibliography, that we realized we were both tracking down the same bits of information, and realized, why should we spend our time doing the same thing? Why don't we kind of divide and conquer and collaborate on this? And he and I have gotten together on research trips before to go into libraries and go through archives and things of that nature, making lots and lots of photocopies. We had to do it because it didn't exist. And we published part of it in one format in a book on Amos, what was nonfiction. And we're going back and forth over exactly what the format of this publication will be. Early on, we signed a contract well ahead of the curve with University of Michigan Libraries to publish it not as a book, but as a searchable database, which I thought would have far more utility and become more accessible. But what you lose out of the database is the kind of narrative approach that if you were to print it out in chronological order, this is where you see things happen. And with Amos in particular, I can go through a period of a couple of years and look at the essays he was writing, look at a lot of the feature articles in journalism he was doing, the book reviews especially, that he was getting paid lots of money to write these reviews. And the books he was reading, it suddenly, 3 years later, maybe not too sudden, a novel emerges that, guess what, locks in with a lot of those themes. So for a writer who said he never does research, he's doing his research and getting paid for it. And it's just that his research isn't getting out and doing a lot of legwork in the Thomas Wolfe sense. It's sitting in and doing a lot of reading and immersive scholarship that way. But you can see that happen time and again. And preoccupations that writers aren't aware that they have, you can often see start to emerge through a long publication history like that. So it's really the kind of biography of a career, not just a bibliography, to think of it that way.
And how to read those literary works, even something as basic as pulling together a canon of these authors' fundamental work in that situation sounds like it gets complicated. You told me a story once about one of these authors and the complexity of tracking down an article that appeared in. Tell that story.
Yeah. Well, it was Martin Amos.
Okay.
And I felt pretty good at this time about the bibliography, at least certain sections of it. For a bibliographer, one of the things that gets really annoying is that you become kind of like one of these hoarders on these TV shows, that you lose all sense of sanity, and you just want to have everything, and you want to be complete this way. And to know that there's something missing and you can't find it just eats at you and drives you crazy. Like, where will I get this? You know, I gotta have it all. Crazy collector. And, you know, and that becomes part of it, you know. My wife once looked at my bookshelf and she said, really? How many copies of Amos's novel, London Fields, do you really need to have?
And she's a librarian.
So I'm trying to explain all the differences between the different states of uncorrected proofs, the trade copies, and you know, the British, the American, the Canadian. She's having none of it. It's all the same words, ideally, inside those. But I had sent this, and I thought I had tracked down all of his short fiction. I felt pretty good about that I finally found all the original publications of every short story he had done. I was wrong. And so I wrote him a letter. And this is another thing, is don't be afraid to ask for help. If you explain what you're doing, you know, I found that people that you might have thought as unapproachable really are fairly willing to help with things. It depends on who they are and how you approach them as well. So I sent Amos a letter, you know, knowing he had lots of better things to do than answer, you know, mail from me. But I also knew that I had kind of an advantage, that I wasn't going to write to him and insult him or anything. And I knew from reading his work that he does care about posterity. As a writer, it's something that matters to him, that, you know, 100 years from now, he wants to be remembered, you know, for his descendants as one of the best. He sees it as kind of a competition. He's smart enough to know that posterity happens in the academy. It doesn't happen in the contemporary reviews of a novel that can come out with the snarky comments. He's had an entire career of those snarky comments that people have directed at him. But he knows that for him to be read, you know, decades later, it's going to happen in the academy. People are going to sign, people are going to do research and do that. So I suspect that he would be willing to answer again, you know, some questions I had. So I wrote to him and gave him a list and said, anything I'm missing? And I said, yeah, I published my first short story called Debitocracy in Penthouse in 1973 or 1974. And then he wrote, you should have a lot of fun looking for that. And I thought, no, I'm not going to have a lot of fun. Because I can't go to my university library and say, would you order 2 years worth of the British edition of Penthouse? Because I really only need an article. Take the pictures out if you want. I don't care.
I promise.
I'm really doing this for the article, really.
And so I thought, where am I going to find this? Because it's only in the British copy. I mean, if it were in the American Penthouse, I could go out and find some of these like little pervy bookstores or whatever that would have these, and I could find them. You go into my probably over time. So I did what any grad student would do. I'm at penthouse.com. I found lots of interesting things on penthouse.com. I did not find anything about the archives, and I'm pretty sure my computer caught an infection. And then I thought, everything's on eBay over time, right? And it never occurred to me to use eBay as a research tool. So I started doing different keyword searches, Penthouse UK, 1973. And I came, well, before I did that, I found a guy in the Midlands in England who actually sold a lot of these old back issues of, as they like to call it, glamour magazines. And I had sent him an email and said, look, I'm looking for an issue of Penthouse from 73, 74, a short story of this title. If you can just go through each issue, look at the table of contents, I will pay you double whatever it says on there, you know, if you have it. He's like, oh, I'll do it one of these days. You know, I don't have time. So then I thought eBay and started doing the keyword searches. And I came up with a guy who had a lot of things from around that same time period that he was selling. And so I just sent the guy an email, said, look, I'm not interested in buying this, but I'm looking for something really specific here. And the guy was a nice guy. He's like, oh, I don't have that for sale, but I've got it in my personal collection. And give me your address and I'll send you a copy of it. And again, just the kindness of strangers. 'Cause I
Plain
asked him
brown
questions.
wrapper.
And he sent it to me, didn't ask for any favors or anything in return. And I was really happy, and I looked at it, started reading it, and realized that the story jumped, and he didn't include the final page. Again, as a bibliographer, that will drive you crazy. And so I did have the issue. I had the month and the year that I was then able to go back to the lazy guy in the Midlands and go, I want this issue. So I just bought it at the regular price. But without eBay, I might still be looking for it. And things like that happen. Amos is a writer who has general memories about when he published something, and he could be insistent and be wrong. Just as, we might not remember something that seems kind of minor to us that happened 30 years ago or 20 years ago. A friend of mine does a lot of work on the novelist Julian Barnes, and runs Julian Barnes' website for him, done bibliography, and with some books and things. And he met with Barnes, and Barnes took him into his office and said, here, just look through my files. The guy was so anal retentive, he has everything that he ever published or even written in his files in chronological order.
Beautiful.
Most people are just scattered to the wind. And, I found from building bibliographies with my own research, doing my dissertation just helped me to dig in, do bibliographies, and to, the people I was working on to send copies to them. I found out, they actually liked that after a while, when they realized they're not being stalked, to have somebody, somebody looking at things and valuing what they did years ago and totally forgot about.
Yeah, wonderful. I wanted to ask you about your creative writing, and then I want to open up
Sure.
to the class. You went to graduate school initially for creative writing. I think you pursued that quite extensively. Can you talk about about that side of your life, and what may have led to the shift to?
Yeah, it was actually the reason I went to Southern Mississippi. I was recruited down there actually by a lit guy who worked a lot in the creative writing program and wrote well. And I knew Frederick Barthelme's work really, really well as a short story writer and novelist. One of those writers, I just really liked his style and what he did. And realized, I have a chance to go down and study with Frederick Barthelme. Why not? And so I went there, and my grand plan was to go there for 2 years, get my master's degree, and probably go someplace else. I thought at the time, 3 degrees, 3 institutions. That's the way it's done. I liked the program a whole lot. It was the Center for Writers, which still confuses me a little bit, with writing. It was a really strong program, nationally recognized, great writers at the time. There was Mary Robison was there, wonderful, wonderful writer who's taught everybody. Conan O'Brien was in her creative writing class at Harvard. It gives you that. And Donna Tartt, Brett Easton Ellis, she's taught all these people. And so I was studying with Rick, and I was probably about midway through it. I really enjoyed the program. I had great experiences. But I caught myself really interested in more on the literary side, or as the creative writers all call it, the parchment side of the department over there, dismissively that way. And I realized that was really, for my PhD, where I was going to go. And it didn't mean, I thought at the time, an end to creative writing. I could stay engaged in that. And then I wound up, after looking at the different assistantship offers and weighing them for my PhD, I decided to stay put. It didn't seem really worth it to move, and I liked the program and the people there. But that also meant that I was going to have to go and have kind of a face-to-face with Rick, who did feel a sense of competition with the other parts of the program and things there. Because he had spent his career building the Center for Writers, and he didn't start it, but he took it over in the Mississippi Review and gave them national recognition at the time. And so I had an appointment, sat down with his office, said, look, I'm coming back for my PhD, but I'm coming back for literature. And I want to explain why. It's nothing to do with the program. It's just that I feel that I can do both things at one time. And his response was great. He said, okay, that's good. We need some right-thinking folks over there anyway. In other words, we need scholars who understand how writers think. I've had colleagues who pulled back from that when people would say, well, as a writer, I see it this way. I think it's a valid remark. There are certain things that you tend to focus on and certain things you tend to ignore in creating, whereas as you're looking at how it's put together, people see totally different things that way. It makes me more attuned to, I think, rhythms and language as I read as well.
So do you think that background may have aided in you being a stronger scholar of contemporary writing with, like you said, not having a long view, having to watch those patterns?
Yeah, I don't know. It might help, but there's also the fact that a lot of contemporary writers were, doing some version of both things.
Okay.
For example, that in the UK, they weren't teaching so much. A lot of them, teach at universities, but they were also sustaining themselves from doing a lot of journalism. And a lot of, I think, the best critics were also novelists, like David Lodge, Malcolm Bradbury, who did have university positions, really good careers as well. But they were particularly strong critics, and I think it was part because of their backgrounds as novelists as well, that they were torn in a way in two different angles, as reading and writing in a double bind, as David Lodge would put it that way.
Nice.
I don't think it's a sense of really being better or worse than anyone else, but I think it does bring out a different dynamic. Lodge is sort of the rare example who, is, an absolute critic, wonderful critic while he was at the university on critical theory. He wrote anthologies, critical theory for undergrads to, start to understand all of these things. But that wasn't, what he's doing now. When he retired that part of his career and is still a creative writer, a novelist.
Excellent.
But I think it probably made me more attuned to some things that I might not have been. The comparison that I always make is if you look at an art program, it's really what you see in terms between art studio and art history a lot, where they often don't get along because they're seeing things radically different at times. And when you have a strong creative writing program and a strong literature program, there is a lot of that competition. I was lucky where I had professors who taught in both.
Yeah.
And it helped me realize they didn't have to balkanize it wholly that way.
And you were politic about how you made that shift though too. That's an important lesson
Oh yeah,
too.
yeah. Because it could have been misperceived that as a snub or something else. And my concern wasn't so much of what would Rick initially think. I know him, I respect him, continue to admire the guy that he would understand. But there is, I suspect some of you have discovered this, that something can happen that one of your colleagues in graduate school can misunderstand, repeat to somebody else, and it snowballs like crazy and it's not there. I had someone when I was in grad school that I got really upset with, a bunch of friends, we were out eating, and she was really rude to a waitress for no reason whatsoever. And it got to the point where it was embarrassing, her rudeness. And we started letting her know that we weren't so pleased with that, my wife and I at least. And the next day I heard that she was complaining to me. I don't know what Hunter's problem was the other night. It's like, he just didn't seem very happy. I guess he and his wife aren't getting along. Maybe they're getting a divorce.
Oh my gosh.
So then when it came back to me, I said, no, we're getting along fine. It was really all about her.
And how self-aware she
but
is.
by the time these conversations continue and get back to my wife about when we're getting divorced, I probably will be getting a divorce. So that was the kind of rumor mill I was in at the time. And I knew that something like that, getting back to Rick, could really be twisted around. He didn't like what you're doing. Which, if I were Rick, would certainly take that as personal. So because of the way he built it, and it was as far removed from the truth as possible. So.
Absolutely. Do you guys have questions for Dr. Hayes? Go ahead, Bill.
Well, while you think about that, Bill, I will say that when you're dealing with contemporary literature, that even though you can have at times writers help you out and answer your questions, you also have to recognize and be sensitive to the fact that you're dealing with people who may well read what you write. And things that, had I been writing about, Victorian novels, I wouldn't have thought twice about. On the Self book, I was going back and forth through certain things, like Joe mentioned the names of his children in the biographical introduction. It doesn't seem to be that necessary for his career, but for the biography, or is that too personal?
What did you decide?
I decided to include them and just name them, and that would be it. And just as I would name, his ex-wife, his brothers, talk more about his parents. I also had the thing of having to write about his mother, whose journals he used in one of his novels, used her voice. And there's a novel I taught once, and a student got really upset with the novel. So I just don't believe that people like that really exist. Word for word came from an actual person.
Yeah.
Some of the most offensive passages in it. But it's okay for him and for his brother to make negative comments about their dead mother. I can't do that. I decided, that would be very rude, misperceived. So to explain that aspect, that I would, I had to use direct quotations from them and what they were saying and weigh it against comments that other people made as well. So it does make you hypersensitive to that. And I think you're also wondering, boy, if they read this, what are they going to make of the way I interpreted their work?
Right.
Because there's going to be a lot of personal stuff that they were likely thinking of that won't be available to most people. A lot of private jokes as well. So it must amuse them to no end to see what other people would make of it. I have, as I thought, a disadvantage of being an American and looking at this as a friend of mine explained it, a scholar whose work I admired, and actually tracked him down in graduate school because I couldn't believe he was showing up at my university to do research. And I thought, it can't be the same guy. And he said, well, I think we need more Americans doing it for that sense of perspective that you're able to bring to it. And the number of Americans working on particular groups of contemporary British writers is a lot smaller than you would imagine. We've all been on a conference panel. You can almost put it that way. We're all in a book together. And that's only a slight exaggeration.
Yeah.
But I've got to be at a conference, in a few weeks, and then the subject of the conference is going to give a reading at the end of it.
Wow, no pressure.
No
That's
pressure.
not what I meant at all. What advice would you have for some of the students in the class who, I guess my question is twofold, who may be pursuing a writer who has either very little written about them or very little written about them recently, like J. Mason Brewer, for example. the other side of that is, how did you, moving into Martin Amos, what were the signs that made you so confident that there was going to be an upsurge of interest in him?
I'll take the last part first.
Okay.
It was simply, to use his own words about Saul Bellow, the novelist that he admired a great deal, it was just a wonderful phrase that Amos wrote. Said that Bellow's sentences just seemed to weigh more than everybody else's.
Oh,
that they had more gravitas to them. And I felt that about a lot of Amos's work. A lot of scholarship can actually come from frustration, and just as good, novels and everything else can come from anger or whatever you might be feeling. You find a way of restructuring that, representing it. I would get annoyed at a lot of the book reviews. Do these people not get it? Or why do they only get it 10 years after the fact? Which actually has seemed to be the case. 1995, Martin Amos published a novel. Some of the most brutal book reviews, personal attacks that you can imagine, came out at the time, weighed by a few good ones. And about 8 years later, published another novel that got even more personal reviews. And I found it amusing that in those reviews, people are saying, but it's not as good as the information, the 1995 novel. What, did that suddenly get good?
That's right, because I did that too.
Or did it take that long for people to kind of appreciate it and not deal with the emotions, or to actually maybe get around reading it in some cases? Write the review, read the book has been the case a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of embarrassment happens. As far as a writer like Jamieson Brewer or anyone else goes, looking at the lack of critical commentary, I think it raises one obvious question immediately that it should, and say, an honest appraisal. Does the writer deserve critical commentary? Is there something worth pursuing, worth writing about? And if your answer is yes, then you don't look at it as an obstacle. Look at it really and legitimately as an opportunity. Here is your way in to bring attention to something that hasn't been done before. It doesn't mean that you're going to meet, you won't meet with resistance. You will. When people don't know who you're writing about, if it's a regional writer or whoever it might be, that's your task of contextualizing it. Years ago, saw Harold Bloom on one of his interviews, Charlie Rose, being Harold Bloom, if you're familiar with him. And he was, I don't know if this was the Harry Potter interview where he was dismissing, the Harry Potter books at the beginning of that craze. But Charlie Rose asked him a question about writers who had been ignored, especially Victorian writers who had been ignored in the period. Disenfranchised, I think was the term he used. And Bloom said, "You must remember, Charles, these writers have been ignored for a reason."
That's so new.
Bloom's reasons, sadly, could well have been because they were women. Good enough, and not a legitimate, argument I think to make now by any stretch of the imagination. But he was a canonical figure. If you weren't one of these very prescribed writers, you're not worth it. You would have read The Cream Rises to the Top.
Yeah, the
right?
great books are the great books, once
Exactly.
and for all. Yeah.
And so that to me was exactly the attitude of what you have to overcome. It doesn't mean that it's entirely wrong. Yes, there are writers who are ignored because they're not worthy of attention. But that's what you do early on in discovering something. And if you decide it is worthy of attention, then you find ways of bringing attention, contextualizing it. Conversely, it could be a writer who's getting the wrong source of attention that people have been misinterpreting, for example. So one of the reasons why I started doing the self work, because I think at the time, I was writing the book, there may have been like 5 articles in the MLA on it. People weren't writing about it because all the book reviews said, oh, you know, it's a trend, it's a fad, he's going to fade away. His books aren't of any consequence. And, you know, 20 years later, he's still publishing and getting recognized of something. And that was taken in part because people in the UK would see him on television quite a bit. He would pop up on some sort of, like, not quiz shows necessarily, they kind of were, you know, maybe like a version of the Daily Show or something. He would pop up on as a frequent guest on a lot of these satirical BBC programs. And it annoyed him to no end. You know, I can tell you that he said that, you know, he didn't like giving readings anymore because when he would go and the place would be packed, he said, I know how many books I sell and they're not buying my books. It's because they want to go see somebody who's on TV. They want to go see a celebrity or what they think of as a celebrity. And so then he has to deal with, you know, ill-informed questions about them. And, you know, I looked at it, you know, reading these reviews about what are they reading? Are they reading different books that I'm reading? And you know, I actually said that to a friend of mine and said, you know, somebody needs to do a book. And he said, no, you need to do the book on it. So you know the work more than anyone else. And at the time, you know, I was thinking, yeah, it's not a bad idea because I've been working on Amos quite a bit. And I don't want to get pegged as the Martin Amos guy. As a consequence, I got pegged as the Will Self guy.
So, in getting an in to communicate with the authors, I was able to get an interview for my master's with Nick Hornby. I think we talked about it some, but I was going through it was an email exchange with an agent's assistant, and it was a long process, and I had read, you know, all the interviews with him. They all asked generally the same questions, so I came up with different questions and sent them, and they wrote back, well, he doesn't really read literary criticism, and that was, you know,
Don't believe it.
Well, so I rewrote my questions and sent them back, and so anyway, it was a months-long process. Is there a better way to?
Yeah, email helps, direct email. It depends. I mean, I've, you know, corresponded with a few people. I mean, you know, it's a great thing that during my dissertation, I was able to correspond with the subjects of my dissertation and correspond directly to them. Yeah, I would somehow manage to get their home addresses, for example, and just
They
send them
call
along.
those people stalkers.
I mean, they get a lot of mail that they don't want to read, and it all depends on how you approach them initially. And as I said, you know, if you explain what you're doing and that you're serious, I found that people are willing to help. Now, there was something that happened that was kind of amusing, that one of the poets I wrote about, I had asked him a question about this journal they published in and co-edited. And he said, well, what you need to do is to write to the editor. And a guy named Richard Boston, who we never had the chance to meet in person, but we became really good friends through correspondence over a while. And he gave me Richard's address. And, you know, I didn't even know about all the books that Richard had done or anything at that point. And so I wrote him a letter, and I said, well, Craig Raines suggested I contact you about that. I thought that was a brilliant introduction. You know, use the name of the guy he knew and got along with, right? I sent that off. A few days later, just about the time I imagine landing, you know, in his mailbox, I pick up a copy of the New Statesman, the magazine, and lo and behold, there's a page-long editorial from Richard Boston explaining, criticizing a Craig Rain article and everything that was wrong with Rain as a writer. I thought, oh, and so now he's getting a letter that says Craig Rain's invested. And I didn't hear from him for months. And so I thought it hit at the wrong time. He ignored it. Yeah, my loss. Just several months later, like 3 or 4 months, I actually got a letter or an email from him apologizing that it just got buried underneath a stack of papers. And he meant to write back and he forgot. And that opened up a long correspondence. And up and lasted up until he died. And he sent me all kinds of copies of his journal. Still have them. That would have been almost impossible for me to find. But it really depends on how you make that initial contact. It also depends, Bill, on who the person is.
Does it depend as well on the where you are in the project? Is the fact that your dissertation, I guess, at that point would have been I mean, this is not a paper that I'm writing for a single class or even an interview that I'm just interested in doing. I'm doing a dissertation on you.
Yeah, and I was also lucky enough to be dealing with people who understood academia.
That's huge, I think,
As well. I mean, Amos is one of those guys that, he had the tough career choice to make. When he finished at Oxford, he graduated with a first degree, which is the equivalent of an honors degree, one of the highest rankings. He did so well there. And it carried an automatic invitation to return as a postgraduate, or as we call it, a graduate student, at Oxford. And so his career plan was to stay at Oxford, become a Renaissance scholar, specifically Shakespeare, and become an Oxford Don. That was going to be his career path. And he was well on his way of doing that. One of his Dons there, not Valentine, Jonathan Wordsworth, great nephew of William Wordsworth, said, you know what, why don't you just go back to London for a year? You want to write a novel. Because of your last name, somebody's going to publish it. You don't have to worry about that. And if nothing happens, then you can come back here. So use Oxford, being an Oxford Don as your fallback career. And he did it. Then he got to publish a second novel, then a third novel, and and it wasn't until a few years ago when Manchester University gave him a huge pile of cash to be a member of their creative writing program. Well, that also corresponded at the time where people got upset about that. It was wonderful. This guy is getting, I think, £85,000 to teach one class, and and he only shows up like once a month or something like that to campus. What kind of value are we getting? What a waste of money. That wasn't what it was. What it was it came at the time when they realized how to do assessment in the UK. And shortly after he got that appointment, he had to send off a list to Manchester of everything he had published in the last 5 years. So now, as a faculty member, they were able to use his publications for their assessment and grants that they were looking to get. So it was a good investment for them, and you see a lot of that going on.
Excellent. So I just have 2 more questions, and everybody else, if you have questions as well. One of them is kind of an advice for the students in this class. Doing archival research, I guess like doing any kind of research, but it seems just really clear when you're doing archival research, is the stuff we need in order to draw the conclusions that we want to draw is simply unavailable, or there doesn't seem to be any straight path to anywhere at any point. And what would you say to help us understand how likely that is to be in most any research, I guess, and how do you help us feel good about that?
Okay. So essentially the answers, or the questions that you have going into it, you're not finding the answers to, and always happens. So then you have to shift the question a little bit. You have to find new ones. Part of the problem with archival research now, there are good catalogs available, so you can get a sense of what they're going to have, but you don't know what those contents are going to be. You can see that I have a box of correspondence between this writer and this person or whoever it might be. That doesn't tell you anything about the contents. It's just going to give you a range of dates and who the principals were involved. When you start reading it, you never know what you're going to find. I've actually discovered information that made me uncomfortable in a sense of, why should I find out more about this person's career and the reasons for a book not being published than the person himself knows? I saw the internal editorial correspondence going on. Then I saw the letter that was sent from the editor who wanted to publish the book, and then being told by the publisher, we're not publishing. And so the editor, said, I am not publishing your book. He took the fall for that. So throughout the rest of the novelist's career, he thought that editor had rejected him when that editor was actually his advocate. And I thought, why should I have access to that if he doesn't know? I know that he wouldn't care, but it was one of those things that kind of makes you a little bit uncomfortable, I feel. I would never have expected to find that. So you have to have an open mind when you go into it. And you have to be greedy. You have to be selfish in the sense of, is there something here that I could use? Not something that I could use to advance my career. If you're interested in archival research, I would suggest read a novel, A.S. Byatt's novel, Possession. Because what you see in that novel is not what really happens. It's, and Byatt knows it.
Yeah.
She was actually, she directed one of my friend's dissertations at UCL once, oddly. I didn't know that until just a few years ago. And wound up with her email address. So I was on a chain email once, and I looked at myself, ooh, I got A.S. Byatt's email address in there. And what she does is write about the greedy, American who wants to just possess all the papers and take them out of the country for his personal collection. That would be me. And then you have this other scholar who does from good intention, absolutely what you should not do when he discovers an unpublished letter from a Victorian poet, modeled very closely on Robert Browning in this case. And he starts reading it, he gets excited, and he knows that this is an important letter. It's a career changer for him. It could change this poet's standing as well as another poet's standing. So there's a lot at stake from this letter. And he thinks, wow, but if I leave, what am I going to do if I leave it here? What if somebody finds it? So he does what you would never do, and have your letter, have a stack of papers, like that. Because, the university didn't know the letter existed. He just found it inside of the book, stuck in. That would never happen. Don't ever steal a letter with intent of going home, copying it, and then, because then you have to try to sneak it back in and everything, and you can do all sorts of damage to the artifact. When you do archival research, you actually have to be very, very careful. If you go to an archive, they will give pretty specific instructions of what you can do and what you can't do. Some letters, some books, you have to wear gloves to handle. Others you're not allowed to touch, that somebody will actually handle for you. It just depends on the fragility of them, how old they are. But at the minimum, you're not allowed to take pens in. You're not allowed to take your own paper in. They give you paper, and they'll give you pencils, or you can use a laptop, which won't damage anything that way. And they usually give you like bright yellow paper so they can always see it. I think few of the manuscripts you might be handling are going to be bright yellow as well. Things that they've found over time. So, you have to be careful, and you have to treat these things
No
with a lot of
coffee.
respect. And, but it's a wonderful way to spend many hours when you don't know what you're going to find as well.
And just the meanderingness of it. I mean, I guess if it were easy to do, then somebody else would have already done the topic. So there's a treasure trove of stuff.
And it also depends on what part of your research you're at. When you start trying to clear the forest, as it were, you look around and there's so much work to do, but you're not going to be able to do it. And it's probably a really bad metaphor in this, but you're not going to be able to do anything until you sort of pick a corner and get started. And you don't concentrate necessarily on the huge road that lies ahead of you. Scholarship is scholarship. It's always going to be ongoing. There are some projects that I've looked at, but I couldn't even bear just getting started on that with the immensity of it.
Yeah, especially these are untraveled roads for the most part, and so there's a lot of work to be done. So finding that corner, or that person, or that way in.
And that becomes its own thing for a while. That becomes the first paper, and then the idea, and then you start connecting those things, presenting at the conference, and if you're able to sustain interest in it, then it continues to expand and to build upon itself. But you start with knocking it down to size, and having something that you can work with at that time. So you don't look at developing, the J. Mason Brewer, critical editions or anything like that with the complete writings, because these are the complete, right? And what you do is you start looking at those publications that you have and saying, how does this fit in? And then you use your own critical perspective to pull into it. Where do you come theoretically at this material, just as you would approach anything else? Are you taking, a kind of new historicist angle? Are you taking a Marxist approach? Whatever it might be.
What's the? I actually have a couple questions. I don't want to let you leave without you saying something about the Sam Rayburn series. But I would love for you to say a word about bibliographic essays, about the value of bibliographic work, especially in a space where so little work has been done, like a Dick Fulkerson bibliography or a J. Mason Brewer.
Okay. No, I think it's great, because one thing that does, you have to remember that you have to recalibrate, I think, your idea of what a bibliography is. That our students hate them because they look at them as, this is where you're going to go check up on me to make sure I've done the things that I need to do. And in some cases, yes, that's true. But that's not the purpose they serve. What they should be doing, whether it's a sample works cited list or whatever, which is an enumerative bibliography of that sort, just a really small one, that you have a list of resources that somebody can follow up on later and know where to go. You're pointing them in the right direction. Here, if you're to do the Dick Fulkerson bibliography, for example, you're gathering together the first place, all those publications that are at least findable, or what kind of relevance do you want your bibliography to serve? The one thing that you have to ask when you build a bibliography is, what is its purpose? What is the scope of this? If your answer is that you want to build a bibliography for the sake of just doing a bibliography, it's the wrong answer. It's not worth doing it, because it's not really serving any purpose. If this is a bibliography that will help bring attention to a serious body of work, to something that has been unfairly neglected or whatever it would be, you can begin there. And then you think, what type of bibliography does it need to be? How extensive does it need to be? And these aren't, questions that are as easily answered as you might think. It's one of the things I have going on with the Amos bibliography. I actually devised a descriptive system for that I thought worked really well for modern book production. I'm beginning to re-question even that and wonder, in this day and age, wouldn't digital images suffice for all of that? Do I need to do quasi-facsimile transcriptions? Am I just doing it because that's been the way for the past 100 years? And that's what people seem to think. So that would mean deleting hundreds of pages out of it. But it's something I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
What is the real purpose? The purpose is to have a version of these books, many of which are hard to find, to save people the trouble of traveling around to different libraries to try to get their hands on them. Here they would be able to see an image to understand through the descriptions of what they would look like. I think a good digital image might capture that better than as good of transcription as I would think. There are questions with descriptive bibliography that you have to look at. How do you describe something? How do you describe color? If you look at California in 2011 there, what is the color on the end of that? Is that red? Is that bright red? Is that a certain kind of red? If you're trying to describe that, what term would you use? Are you going to use the U.S. color code system where there's actually a numerical entry once you match up that precise color? That's the way that you can be most accurate. But is that going to serve the purpose of your audience? That you'd look at and say, it's a bright red. It gets the point across. Or is it, if you look at something that's kind of orange, was that once a bright red that just got sun faded?
Uh-huh.
So the question of accuracy comes into it as well.
Excellent. And you guys have, of course, we've said several times, a choice between doing a seminar paper with that we think of more typically, I guess, in a course like this, or so valuable, especially in these areas that have been so understudied. These bibliographic essays with purpose can go a long way to help facilitate other people coming into.
I haven't even talked about bibliographic essays, which are wonderful, wonderful tools and good opportunities for publication and other things that you might not think about. Oh, it's just the introduction of my dissertation, or it's a paper. There are places that will publish those to round up a certain body of work into one place, or it could become a good introduction to something as well.
Yeah, exactly. That first essay you guys read, the 100-year retrospective, was essentially a bibliographic essay. So Hunter Hayes is also the senior editor of the Sam Rayburn series on rural life. Could you tell us about that project, its goals, some of the things that you guys have published, and what you guys would like or have in the hopper?
Yeah, I'm the editor, and so really senior. And, Sam Rayburn's series on rural life began here in 1997 with Bo Grenshaw started it. It's a collaborative program under the President's Office at our university in conjunction